So developmental criminology is a fairly new area in terms of studying criminal behavior. There are people that have been doing work in it for a while, but it took a little bit of time in the field for it to be understood as being its own arc, its own kind of separate branch of this discipline. And people who believe in it and believe that it's important to study criminology from a developmental perspective come at studying crime and criminal behavior from three main ideas, three main perspectives. And that is, first of all, that it's important to study the development of offending and antisocial behavior. So not that different from the traditional theories. Instead of just marking whether or not someone has ever committed crime or not, you should understand what very early life factors in your early childhood development might lead you down that path, put you at high risk to commit crime. So the development of it is really a key to this area. Another thing that developmental criminologists think of as being critical is understanding how risk factors can differ depending on your age. Things that might cause you to, or put you at risk to be delinquent and a problem child at age 5 are not going to be the same things, in other words, according to these scholars, that influence your behavior at age 15. We need to understand, according to this perspective, the different risk factors that matter to you at different ages. What's going to influence your behavior at 8 is different than 12, is different than 18, is different than 35, etc. And we should understand all of them. So that's another really big part of developmental criminology. And the final part is the idea that we should be interested in how life events throughout a person's life course, throughout their entire childhood into late adulthood, how different life events might impact a person's behavior. So, a couple of the key themes here are that people are changeable, that people develop, and development in early childhood matters, but there are also things that happen throughout your life that can influence you. So it's kind of an interesting area of criminology because they're placing a lot of importance on early childhood, but they're also placing a lot of importance on life events throughout your life, saying that we as humans, as people, are malleable. We're able to respond and adapt to different things. And depending on the risk factors that we kind of carry through our life with us, that's going to have a lot to do with whether or not we are able to change our life course based on different life events. So we'll talk about some of the theories that came out of this. Developmental criminology is kind of an overarching field, and there are a couple specific theories within it that we'll talk about here. And I think you'll notice that a lot of the people who have produced research in this area are people who have a background in things like family studies, early child development, psychology. We're getting into people who don't necessarily have as much of a purely sociological perspective on crime. So let's talk about some of these elements of developmental criminology. The first one is this idea that different factors in our life are going to have different effects at different ages. And that kind of sounds like a simple idea, but it's not something that a lot of criminology theory necessarily thinks a lot about. Not a lot of the theories that we've gone through in this class so far have thought about different age groups, different effects of things over time. But what developmental criminologists want us to understand is the factors that matter to you at different stages of your life are going to change. Another feature of developmental criminology is a belief that we should find common pathways of delinquent behavior through life. Even though there are multiple pathways, there are people that you can kind of fit along several different pathways, typical paths into delinquency and crime throughout their life. And you'll hear examples of this. For example, there are some people who believe that there are people that you can call early onset offenders, people who start out very early in life, getting into trouble, throwing temper tantrums, being violent and aggressive. They end up getting into delinquency as a teenager and then eventually crime. People who right from the beginning, early on in their life, demonstrated problem behavior. And that kind of carries out throughout their lives. So developmental criminologists acknowledge, yes, that is one pathway that people might follow. But there are also late starters. There are also people who have a fairly healthy, normal childhood. They get raised, they go into adolescence, and they don't really start committing crime until they come into late adolescence, early adulthood. It's a very different pathway, and different explanations are behind it. And there are also some people who go through almost their entire early development from childhood through to early adulthood without really doing anything that delinquent or criminal, but get into certain types of criminal behavior later in their life as adults. That's a different pathway, and there are different risk factors and triggers and indicators along the way. So these aren't the only pathways. This is just a sampling for you to get an idea. But what developmental criminologists say is that you can put most people into some kind of a common pathway, and depending on what happens throughout their life, that's going to have a large role on whether or not they stay on that path. So one of the things that developmental criminologists acknowledge, something that's at the heart of developmental criminology, is for a lot of people, there is continuity in offending from childhood to adulthood, meaning that there are people who you can see who demonstrate at a very early age a lot of indicators that they are going to have behavioral social problems. And those children oftentimes develop into adolescents who have these problems and adults who have these problems. There is continuity. But what comes up in developmental criminology, which is really critical for some of the theories, is an idea that got put out there by an early family studies author named Lee Robbins back in the 1960s. And in Robbins' work, she describes what we now call Robbins' paradox. And this has to do with this problem of continuity, how much continuity is out there. So in Robbins' paradox, the essential idea is that, yes, if you actually look at adults who are committing crime, say you go into a prison and you look at adults who you could probably classify as antisocial, criminal, most of them were antisocial children. If you ask them to report back on their life, they will describe to you a path into adulthood that it doesn't surprise you that they committed, that they found themselves in prison. So most antisocial adults were antisocial children. There is continuity. But we also know, and this is what the paradox is that a lot of children display antisocial problem behavior and don't become antisocial adults. In other words, displaying early risk factors doesn't predetermine that you're going to be a criminal as an adult. So that's a paradox. That's something we need to understand. Why is it that some people demonstrate continuity and some people show the ability to change? And what developmental criminologists would say is we need to understand what happened at different life stages of these children to explain why they continued or why they were able to stop, why they kind of grew out of committing crime. So in developmental criminology, people that we would call chronic offenders would probably look a lot like Wolfgang's 6%. They're probably people who very early in life displayed problem behavior, delinquent behavior, dabbled in actual deviant criminal behavior, and from a really early point in life began getting into trouble, committing crime, and that's something that they did throughout most of their life. So chronic offenders have early onset. Once they start offending, they do it a lot, they have a high frequency, and they do that for a really long time in their lives. For most of their adulthood, they're engaging in some kind of criminal activity. But, and this is where developmental criminology really separates itself from some other parts of this field, you can't just explain that by one stable trait. In other words, developmental criminologists don't think that chronic offenders are out there because of self-control. They don't believe that there's this stable trait that can explain a person's behavior their whole life. What developmental criminologists think is important is to understand what happened to that person in childhood, then what happened to them in adolescence, what happened in late adolescence, early adulthood, because at any one of those points, it is possible for things to develop and change. But if they don't, that explains stability of criminal offending. So it's not a trait approach, it's a developmental approach. One of the most famous examples of a developmental criminology theory is one that was written in the early 90s by a researcher named Terry Moffat. And we now call this theory Moffat's dual taxonomy. And I'll explain to you why that is. So Moffat is a psychologist. Terry Moffat is, by training, a psychologist. And she actually does a lot of work in neuroscience and early childhood development now. Her most current work, 1993 is almost 20 years ago now. Her more current work is actually doing behavioral genetics work, but she started out looking at early childhood development. And she began this paper and this line of research by asking a very basic question that comes right out of that paradox, comes right out of Raman's paradox. And the question was, why do most delinquents not go on to become criminals as adults? So her question was, yes, most people get into some trouble as children, as adolescents, but not all of them keep going. Why is that? Why do most delinquents stop? And it's called a dual taxonomy because she really believed that you can divide almost everyone up into two basic groups. If developmental criminology is about people suggesting different pathways, Moffat believed that there are two main pathways, so it's a dual taxonomy. And her two types of offenders that she named in this initial paper were people that she called life course persistent offenders and people that she called adolescence limited offenders. There's been a lot of discussion amongst developmental criminologists about how many groups should we say are out there? How many pathways are there? Well, Moffat really believed that you can fit almost everyone into these two groups. So she believed in a pretty simple model here, that you can fit almost everyone, everyone in the population into either being someone that she would call a life course persistent offender, an LCP, or an adolescent limited offender. And what she did in her taxonomy is she came up with a description of the pathway into both of these trajectories to explain why it is that once you kind of, depending on how you develop early in life, that's going to play a really big role on what kind of offender you might end up being. So let's talk about this first group, these life course persistent offenders. Moffat believed that people who she would describe as life course persistent offenders was not a very large group of people. And her basic description of how it is that these people's lives begin is she points to biological factors, kind of external things that can happen to you early in life. So what she suggests is there's a very small percentage of people who are born with certain neuropsychological deficits, and that, with a combination of very poor infant care, are going to predispose them to antisocial behavior. So she really goes back to some of the ideas we already learned about in terms of early perinatal risk factors. Babies who are born to high-risk mothers, mothers who smoked and drank a lot during pregnancy, babies who are born and the birth is a very traumatic event, babies who are born with a very low birth rate. She kind of points to all of those factors and say, those are a problem because they're going to lead to some neuropsychological deficits. And that, combined with things like poor feeding, poor care, is going to lead them to be slightly antisocial over time. They're not going to develop the same ability to be social, normal, competent beings. So, according to her, this group of people, this small group of people who unfortunately enter the world this way, they're going to, from a pretty early point in their life, display behaviors that are going to get them into trouble. When they're very, very young, they're going to be very fussy. They're going to have a lot of tantrums. They're going to elicit a lot of negative responses to their behavior. They're going to have to be punished a lot because of their behavior. And their personality traits and their deficits in terms of psychologically are going to limit their ability to form kind of normal pro-social relationships. So these are going to be kids, essentially, in Moffat's mind, that when they get into preschool, not only are they not going to be able to get along with and interact with other kids in their school very well, but because they get into so much trouble, they're going to be constantly getting punished. They're going to constantly elicit these negative responses from people. So this isn't really setting up these kids very well for future life. And these are going to be kids, according to Moffat, that exhibit problem behavior and criminal behavior throughout their life because they got saddled very early in life with deficits that make them really unable to be socially competent. They're going to get into all kinds of problems in forming relationships, in avoiding kind of delinquent, impulsive, risky behavior. For Moffat, this is this very small group of chronic, serious offenders. These are people who start off really early in life getting into trouble and never really stop. She doesn't think that this is a large group. She would probably agree with Wolfgang about it being, about 6% of your average birth cohort. But she does acknowledge that these people, even though they're small in number, get into a lot of trouble and create a lot of the problems for their area, their group in general. So those are the life course persistent offenders. And you can see why she gave them that name. Throughout their life course, their entire life, they persist. They're persistent offenders. Then you have the group that she called adolescent limited offenders. And she felt like almost everyone, the majority of the population, everyone, including you guys, almost everyone would fit into this category of adolescent limited offenders. And she describes people who fit into this category as having really normal early childhood and early adolescent development. They grew up in fairly supportive, loving homes. They were taught to be social. They were taught how to interact with people in a normal way. They were set up in a fairly normal way for life. Now, it's called adolescent limited offenders because, according to Moffat, once almost everyone hits adolescence, they encounter what she called the maturity gap frustration. What she meant by that is, when you enter early adolescence, that's when you start going to school with people a lot older than you. You start interacting with a larger range of people and observing behavior of a larger range of people in terms of age. So according to Moffat, when you start adolescence, you start to feel like you should be treated like more of an adult than you're necessarily able to yet. You start going to high school, you see people driving cars, you see people staying out late. You're too young for that still, but you want to be treated like a more mature person, and you're not able to yet. You're still, for the most part, under the control of your parents. So that's why she calls it maturity gap frustration. As an adolescent, you feel that there's this big gap between what you're allowed to do and what you want to do, and that frustrates you. That makes you angry. So according to her, most adolescents go through this. You can all probably think of examples of times when you wanted to be treated more like an adult and your parents wouldn't let you yet. This is not an uncommon idea. And according to her, the amount of delinquency that people get into as a result of this explains why so much delinquency happens in adolescence, because a lot of kids experience this and kind of dabble in criminal behavior. They get into a little trouble. They test the water, see how it feels. According to her, this can explain most people's delinquency. And you got to remember, these kids are also growing up around that small group of life course persistent offenders. So most adolescents are still under the loving, supportive care of their parents, but they see these life course persistent offenders acting a lot older for their age, smoking, drinking, behaving, starting to engage in sexual activities. And they kind of try to mimic that a little, usually in less serious offenses, but they try to compensate for their not being able to be treated like an adult by their parents to get into a little bit of trouble during adolescence. And the reason this is called, again, adolescence limited offending is these kids also had, if you remember, a normal early childhood. So once they start leaving adolescence, once they start entering adulthood, they have that they have the tools, they have the development and the social kind of structural support in their lives to desist from crime. So people who kind of dabble in criminal behavior in adolescence, once they enter early adulthood, they start to realize that if they keep going with that behavior, the consequences of it are going to interfere with who they see themselves wanting to be. So think about it this way for yourselves. Say some of you out there are listening to this and are thinking back to some things that you did in high school that maybe if you got caught you would have got arrested for. According to Moffat, you were doing that because you were trying to stretch your wings a little. You were trying to compensate for not being treated like an adult as you felt you should. But according to her, for those of you who had a fairly normal childhood before that, once you start going to college, getting jobs in early adulthood, you're going to stop committing that delinquent criminal behavior because you don't want to mess up your later lifehood chances. You see yourself as having a future in adulthood, so you desist when the consequences of those criminal actions start to interfere with moving into young adulthood. Not everyone is able to do this, as you can imagine. Some people who dabble in criminal behavior as adolescents get caught and arrested and put in jail, and it does have consequences for them. But for her, this explains why most people do stop. So these are her two groups. It's called a dual taxonomy because she thinks that you can fit almost everybody into these two groups. So let's look at them on a graph here. If you take a look at this graph, you'll see that delinquency, criminal behavior, is on the vertical axis, and your pathhood from childhood to adulthood is on the horizontal axis. So Moffat really saw life course persistent offenders, that small group of people, as following this kind of a trajectory. Right in early childhood, they start engaging in problems up until adolescence, and they keep going through young adulthood. They didn't have the normal kind of childhood to teach them that they had real adult things to lose by continuing to commit criminal behavior, so they keep going. The other trajectory is the life course, the adolescent limited offenders. And for her, you can put almost all teenagers into this group. And coincidentally, she believes that this group explains that age crime curve that is demonstrated in kind of the aggregate data. Because this is the path that most people follow, that explains why the overall age crime curve, peaking in late adolescence, seems to pan out. So these are her two groups. Obviously, the adolescent limited offenders, once they enter adulthood, young adulthood, they start to realize that they have to kind of stop committing those problem behaviors or they won't be able to be successful. She does also, by the way, kind of acknowledge the fact that there are some people who never do anything bad, never do any criminal behavior. People that she calls abstainers from delinquency and crime. But she actually thinks of this as a fairly abnormal, small percentage of people, and tends to call them social isolates. She doesn't really write about it a whole lot, but her take on it is, this is actually a very unusual trajectory for someone to follow. Almost everyone, according to her, even if it's not completely legally illegal actions, almost everyone engages in something that you could call delinquency in adolescence. And these abstainers are actually a very small percentage. So that's her trajectory, and she's done a lot of study with this, really focusing on the life course persistent offenders. So what she'll do is she'll map out people's early biological problems, those risk factors that might make you likely to enter into this life course persistent trajectory. And then she follows and tracks criminal behavior over time and demonstrates with that yes, the people who display the longest, most stable patterns of criminal behavior are people who had these early childhood problems and social deficits.